Kia ora koutou katoa. My name is Dr. Nick Kirk. I am here today to help introduce my colleague, Johanna Yletyinen, who is going to talk to you today, giving a brief introduction about social ecological network modeling. Just to inform everyone, this is a 30-minute session called the I330s that we try and run here at Manaaki Whenua each month to try and inform our staff of different new integrated research techniques that they can learn and use in their research. And so today Johanna is going to be talking to us about network modeling and connecting together social and biophysical data. So Johanna, I'll let you take over. Please everyone feel free to ask questions in the side panel on the side, and I will ask them to Johanna at the end of the presentation. Also, if you're having any technical difficulties, please write again in that chat box, and either myself or Tiffany will address your concerns. But I'll give it over to Johanna now. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Nick, and thanks everyone for coming. So this is just a brief introduction to social ecological network modeling, which is, for me, I think this is the most exciting way of doing science. I really like it. So as I wrote in the introduction, I think most of us work with connectivity and interactions in some ways, whether it is about who eats whom or how things spread in space, or who do you learn things from, who has influence to the policymakers, what makes you feel at home at some place or connected to a community, or how do behaviors or new techniques spread. And in network science, we look at this connectivity in form of networks. So we look at nodes and links. Nodes are elements, any kind of social ecological space or anything, and the connection between them. And the idea is that the structure of the network affects the nodes that are embedded in it, and also the nodes then in themselves affect the network structure. So this is all complex systems science. And then when we talk about social ecological networks, we put humans in nature. So humans and environment are integrated, and you can't really separate them. So, and it is exactly this merging of humans and environment that makes social ecological network modeling really powerful. So we can look at, it really becomes only one system, humans and environment. And it's a really highly flexible tool, because network analysis has been around for decades. It has been used both in ecological and social sciences. So there are plenty of tools to choose from. And you can take data from different sources. It might be interviews, it might be catch data, it might be predator-prey relationships, or it might be basically anything, friendship. And this way we can get new insights and better understanding on the environmental well-being and human well-being. And when I wrote in the invitation that this method might give you new ways of using the data you already have, this is what I meant. So you can merge your data with another data set and get a new idea, or you might just look at differently on your data and think of the connectivity in it. And the kind of question we look at is, well, as I said, we often look at the structure of the social ecological systems. We look at often we look at certain patterns that tell us that this is a resilient system or this is not resilient. With networks, we can look both at the direct and cascading impacts of change, whether the changes are environmental or social, or coming from outside the network. We can identify which nodes or which elements in the system are important, both if we want to change the system or if we want to keep it as is. And finally, the social ecological systems are not just social plus ecological. There is this merging of them, the intermediate connectivity that causes a lot of processes and things that you can't find if you look at the systems separately. I'll give you 2 examples of what this might mean in practice. These are my challenging slides because I have to try to stop myself from talking about studies too much. So this first example is a really, this quite classic social ecological network setting. So you have a layer of social nodes. These are the white nodes with letter C, and these are fishing tactics, harvesting tactics and the links between them tell how fishers can switch tactics, harvesting strategies. The gray nodes are ecological layer of the network. So these are the fish that are targeted, the target species. And the links between them tell predator-prey relationship. And in this study, we made networks before and after management. And the management here targeted on improving the ecosystem state. And then the question became, how did the fishers adapt to that stage? So we looked at the social system on its own first. And then we disentangled the, oh, now I'm pointing with the finger, but you can see that. Then we disentangled the intermediate connectivity to these kind of social ecological motifs, this sub-pattern on the right-hand side. And with that, we could evaluate how resilient the system has become to future ecological change. So this one used food web data, interview data, and catch data. The second example is work I'm doing with Phil Liver and the Natiwai Iwi on the trying to detect what might be the cultural impacts of environmental change or policies that affect the access of community to nature. And the idea here is that when culture changes, it's often really difficult to identify how. But we know from network science that being connected means that there's a higher likelihood to be disturbed or the disturbance can spread. So in this network, we have all the nodes with capital letters are indigenous values. And then you see the rest is the biophysical elements. So we have gone through interview or coded interview data and looked at how the values are connected to local environment. And then all the nodes with color, red and blue colors are the strongest or the most strongly connected values and biophysical elements in the value system. So that is basically the core of this community's value system. So first we studied this network, or actually the core network, and look at the structure, how connected it is. And for example, we found that nature is highly integrated into the value system. So for indigenous people, you often can't separate the culture from the environment. Yes, and having looked at that, we then looked at individual biophysical elements in this core network. So here's an example of gray-faced petrel, and we can tell that if the community lost access or there was less access to the bird, it would directly affect all these 5 values of the core network. And then if you look at even in the cascading impacts, and this is only 2 steps away from the bird, you would affect almost the entire core network. And as you can see, this is a completely different way of communicating things and showing things. Instead of saying that, oh, this might affect our culture, you can say that it might affect these elements in our culture. Yes, and then now I expect everyone wants to do this. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll give you some guidance on how this is done. This is my friend that often visits my Zoom calls. And I put it here also because I have bad news on the next slide. So this is the kind of lovely moment before it. So the bad news is that there are no guidebooks. So unlike ecological or social network, you won't find a book that will guide you to do social ecological network research. So what you basically end up doing is that you read a lot of network books and network studies, and then you think of that from the space of social ecological system science. So you constantly think back and forth between these 2 fields. And then of course you look at the published studies. So what other people have done, can you do the same or can you go 1 step further from that? But that is also the great thing of it. That's why it is so exciting and so fun, because you can look at the paper from Brain Research, for example, on network studies. And you find some really cool thing that they have done. And you can think that, oh, what would that mean on the social ecological system science? Or if you have some really good question, theoretical question, you can go back to food webs, for example, and see how that would be done there. So the first thing you do is to make a matrix of the connectivity. And there are basically 3 ways. Well, there are more, but these are the main things, main ways to do it. The first one is to do multi-layer network. So this is like in the Fisher example. So you have a social network and an ecological network, and then you connect them together with the intermediate network. And depending on your analysis, sometimes you might have to do 3 matrices or just put all in one. The second type is ecological connected by social. So this could be, for example, kauri forest sites, and the links could be the tourists or people who visit them. And then there's the 2-mode network, like the value network. So the idea here is that you have 2 types of, or could be more, 2 types of nodes and 2 types of links, and you treat it as one matrix or one network. But then you remember in the analysis and in the results interpretation that you actually have 2 types of nodes. So then when you have the matrix, you go to either R, or you can use different softwares. I made some, I put some examples there if you want to make notes. I'm not going to go through them. Well, basically R has packages that I've listed there. NetLogo is agent-based modeling. UCINet is software for network science or network analysis. It requires a license, but you can use it 30 days for free, and it's really handy. And Gepi is free software. Yes. So the most common analysis we do is to look at the system-wide network properties, as we did in the value networks. So these are network indices. For example, is the network highly connected? Is it clustered? How many connections on average do the nodes have? And this is quite simple, and it's really easy to do. The second thing that we often do is the identification of key players and key nodes. So this might be, for example, who is the most connected node, or what is the most connected node? What is most often in between the social and ecological kind of connecting node? Or which farmer, for example, connects farmers to the groups of indigenous peoples or council people, or so on. And then we can also do network interventions. So we can remove nodes that are in the important places. So for example, in the kauri example, we could stop access of people to those forests from where the disease is most spread, for example. Or not most spread, but where they spread most effectively based on the structure of the network. Then what is often done in social ecological network analysis is social ecological motifs. So we look at what are the most common sub-patterns in the network, or most rare. And this is really handy if you have a big network, which is what we often say it's kind of like a hairball. And it's really difficult to see anything, any basic structure in it. So then you can identify sub-patterns that are of interest. For example, you can look at how people usually use natural resources, and then you analyze if they are more common than what you would expect by random, or less common. But it's somewhat tricky to do, and that's why I wrote that it might be good for you to ask someone else to do it. So if people have done it, they have written all the code, and they can run it quickly, and then it's just add one more code on your paper. And then the dynamic and temporal models, which I didn't have an example here. But this basically means that the networks are active, so they might rewire the links, or people might change, or for example, if we have food web, some species might go up in abundance or low in abundance. So the network nodes in themselves can always contain information, and then the links can change. And that way you can, for example, look how the network evolves in time. or if you would have done network intervention with the kauri forests, you could look at how the network or how the people adapt to this change of closing one forest, and then how the disease starts to spread differently or might stop spreading. And then it's not all good. As with any models, getting the good or the right results depends on having right or correct assumptions underlying the network model. And with networks, you need to have quite a lot. You need to know what is interacting and how, and the time scale. So if we work, for example, the picture here shows that if we do dynamic networks, we don't only need to know what is interacting, but what would make the interaction change. And so you need to have some kind of rules for rewiring. But that, I think that's really cool. So if you can do it, it's worth it. And then it's quite data heavy. So you need to have good data both on the social and ecological components of the system, as well as how they are connected. But to some extent, there are random network models that we can use. So for example, for social data, we can think that people who are most alike are more likely to be connected, or we can look at ecological traits and see which species might eat another. And then there's the thing that it does indeed reduce the system to just nodes and links. But then, as I said, you can include information in the nodes themselves and in the links themselves. But that is also why network analysis is so effective, because we can reduce it into the links and nodes. Oh, and that was all, but actually I had one more slide that I thought I'd say if I have time, because it gives an example of how your data might be reused. So what we have been doing lately is to, instead of thinking of social or any kind of networks as closed systems, we have started putting them into the social ecological environment. So for example, in this model here, we have layer B, which is a farmer network, and that is embedded in the landscape, both social and ecological landscape, and with other groups of people like indigenous councils, industry representatives. And so the social network of farmers all the time adapts to the environmental change and to the social change. And then we have used that same thing on the wildings management research. So my intention here is to show that how you can use your data to build a model. So for this model, which looks at the role of social factors in in the invasive species management. So basically we are going from looking at the biological invasions as ecological problem to looking at them as social ecological problem. And we built this model by using an invasion model that already existed at Landcare with Olivia and Norman. And we coupled that, so that's a model of how wilding spread. And we coupled that to the social network that comes from Mike Brown's survey and a lot of other data from that. And then basically the landowners in this model, they constantly adapt to the environment or the invasion spread and what other people are doing. And that's how we merged two data sets to build a model. And that was all for me. Thank you so much. And I have written an article about this at the i3 website. So you can read more, you can anytime email me.
Thank you so much for that, Johanna. A fascinating presentation. I hope everyone enjoyed it. Just in regards to the website that Johanna was talking about at the end, I will hopefully be working on updating that website to update it with this presentation in the next couple of weeks or so it should be there soon. Now, there haven't been any questions lodged in the chat box. For those of you that have some questions, please feel free to do that now. In the meantime, I've got a couple of questions, Johanna. One of them, which is maybe more just about some of the jargon you used and maybe unpacking it a little bit, was at the start of the presentation, you talked about intermediate connectivity. And so I was just wondering if you could sort of unpack that a wee bit more for me. Like, are there different kinds of connectivity? And it sounds like it's different from the links between, like, strong and weak links between nodes in a relationship. So just for someone like me that's really new to all of this, are you able to sort of explain that a wee bit more?
Oh, thanks, Nick. Sorry, I just think that people know everything that I know. Yes, the intermediate connectivity basically just means how the social and ecological are connected. So that's anything, any kind of connections that link these two systems together. And then, as you said, there's also strong and weak links that you can put, or that might emerge there. Mm-hmm. But it's just a fancy word to say that the two systems are connected. And if they are not, then you don't have a social ecological system.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you for that explanation. I guess another question I have is, apart from the really good examples that you presented of your own work in this space, can you think of any off the top of your head where there are really good examples of this kind of social ecological network modeling and research? You mentioned there aren't books that tell you how to do it, but are there sort of examples of really good modeling that inspired you?
Yes, one is, for example, the social ecological mismatches research, which is often done with networks. I haven't done it myself. But anyway, the idea is that you look at how an ecological system is connected. So this could, well, I don't want to use the kauri forest again, but for example, people have used it for the coral reefs and how the how the ecosystems are connected in space. And then once you have the ecological connectivity, you put on top of that the social connectivity. So this could be governance institutions, international, for example, and how these governance institutions are connected in space and how they are managing the system in space. And then if the social and ecological connectivity doesn't align, it actually means that you are not you have a mismatch in the ecosystem governance. So you are managing only half of the system, for example, or some critical nodes are not in the management. And that's quite common. And a lot of the research is about collective action and governance and what kind of, how that affects the environmental outcomes.
Yes, and I can see how that would be applicable to so many different kinds of research that we do here at Manaaki Whenua. It's been fantastic to learn about this. It looks like we have received a question. So let me ask it. I'm not quite sure who the person is who asked it, so apologies there. Where did it go? It says here, this type of analysis is not particularly mainstream, but obviously an important methodology and practice. What do you see as the barriers to this being used more widely? So do you have a sort of an answer for that, Johanna?
Well,
what sort of barriers do you see?
Yes, the whole social ecological systems research is still quite new, and that's why there's still so much to do and why you can come up with new things to do. The most common barrier is that you don't often have data on both the social and ecological side of the question or the problem that you have. So most often what people end up doing is that you have really good data on the ecological part, for example, but then you have very little data on the social or none at all. And then the research becomes more focused on one part of the system. Or you don't have this knowledge of how the two systems are connected. And then I think one part is just that not many people know that this can be done and that there are so many ways of doing it, just because, as I said, there are no guidebooks. And then lastly, there are not so many people who do it. And actually there's one more, that it's sometimes a bit tricky to get funding for interdisciplinary work. And when you publish the papers, it sometimes takes time to find reviewers for the social ecological models. So I think to summarize, it's all quite new, and you can feel it.
That's a fantastic response there, Johanna. We've got a couple more questions through for you, so we've got a few more minutes left. The next question is there a minimum number of variables you must include for the network to be robust? So what do you think about that one, Johanna?
Oh, that's a good question. Right, you can basically have a network of 3 nodes, but that's not a very impressive analysis then. But no, the least you need is the connectivity, because there's so much knowledge on how the structure affects the resilience or the robustness of the network. So if you only know how things are linked, you can already say how the disturbance can spread in the network. So that's the minimum.
Okay. Another question we have here, what material outcomes have you seen from this approach that have actually benefited ecological systems? That's a bit of a thorny one, but how do you feel about that one, Johanna?
You can say that again, give me some time to think.
So what material outcomes have you seen from this approach that have actually benefited ecological systems? So perhaps has a social ecological network gone on to inform governance and policy changes that have then flowed on to improve sort of ecological status, or maybe sort of develop new knowledge that sort of led people to use ecosystems in more sustainable ways?
Yeah, now the answer will suffer from my theoretical, because I mostly do theoretical work. So I have to admit that now I'm not the right person to answer this question. But one thing that comes to mind is the Phil Liver did some, I don't know if Phil is there, I'm talking about it, and Mark Hurst and Jason Tylianakis and others did a work on the on mismatch on the black swans on indigenous environmental governance. And I'm actually not sure if they used that work, but when Mark was starting that, they were mapping connectivity. So this was really bad answer. Yes. Oh,
Well,
on the some of the work from Resilience Center they have done on the social ecological network stuff on the Southern Ocean, I think even. And I think their work, because they are doing a lot of work on the ocean governance. So I think that might have been. But as I said, this is only because I don't personally do so much research on the implementation part.
It's also very new, as you said, Johanna, so although it is a method that it shows great promise, perhaps there's just a lack of these examples of its use in practice because it's such a new method.
Yeah, I think it's mostly lack of my knowledge, so sorry for that.
Well, we've got one more question for you, and thank you everyone for your questions that you've put through. This question asks, how do you deal with nodes, values, things that might actually be part of the network but are not thought about or aren't sort of surfaced or identified? What do those absences do to the analyses?
Yeah, as you see in the slide that is still there, you can have isolates. So these are nodes that are part of the system but are not in the network. And sometimes they can be really important, but they just don't become part of the network. So you can include them in. And then the main answer to that question is that there's always this boundary setting problem. So we can never model the entire system. Or the things never end. You would basically have global system in the end. So you always have to have some boundary to the network. And then that, of course, affects the results as well. What do you take in and what do you not take in? But my solution to that usually is to be really transparent of how the decision is made. And often we make some kind of sensitivity analysis. So for example, with the value network, when we extracted the core network, we tried the different thresholding there. And then in the paper, we included the results of what would the system have looked like if we had had bigger boundary to the core network.
Well, thank you for that response, Johanna. we've come to the end of our 30 minutes, so it's probably time to say goodbye. I want to thank you once again for a fascinating presentation, Johanna. I want to thank everyone for coming and for your fantastic questions that you asked towards the end. Just to reiterate, there will be an update to the i330 website soon, in which we will have a sort of more written material on this that Johanna's written up. Also, I want to let people know that in a couple of weeks' time, there'll be another i330 seminar. I'll be presenting it this next time on systematic literature reviews. So soon you'll be receiving an email about that, and I look forward to hopefully seeing some of you there again. But once again, thank you everyone for coming today. I really appreciate it. I appreciate the presentation, Johanna, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.